Good afternoon. Welcome to the National Civil Rights Museum. My name is Ryan Jones. I have the distinct honor and privilege of serving as the Director of History here at the museum. On May the 19th, 1925, a bright and shining young prince was born to Earl and Louise Little. They named him Malcolm, and he became Malcolm X. Malcolm X, who famously said, "We will gain all of our constitutional rights by any means necessary." Today, the National Civil Rights Museum has the distinct privilege of hosting his daughter, Dr. Ilyasah Shabazz, an award-winning author, educator, and producer. She has authored 5 historical novels, has served as project advisor to the PBS award-winning film Prince Among Slaves, and is currently producing a television series based on her latest 2 publications, X, a Novel, and The Awakening of Malcolm X with Sony Pictures. She is the co-chairperson of the Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz Memorial and Educational Center, the Shabazz Center. In her work to preserve the legacy of her parents, she has dedicated herself to institution building and intergenerational leadership development with the tenets of equal access and opportunity for all people. Dr. Shabazz has furthered her community impact with the City University of New York's Office of Academic Affairs, where she created curriculum to encourage higher education for underdeserved inner-city high school dropouts. She founded and produced a young adult development program to provide historical context on social justice, encouraging personal empowerment and community service as a way of life. As president and founder of the Ilyasah Shabazz Enterprises, she produces a variety of forums dedicated to power, possibility, and sovereignty. Dr. Shabazz holds a Master of Science in Education and Human Resource Development from Fordham University and a Bachelor of Science from Biology at the State University of New York. Currently, she is the adjunct professor at John Jay College, Criminal Justice in New York City, where she teaches perspectives on justice and the Africana world. Grounded in the commitments of her parents, Dr. Shabazz emphasizes empowerment and inclusion in her teaching and scholarship. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Ilyasah Shabazz.
Hello, Memphis. It's such an honor to be here, especially in this space. So thank you for inviting me. Thank you for a wonderful introduction. And before I even start, I would just like to acknowledge one of your citizens, your residents, Kanji Anthony. Are you familiar with her? Yeah, so Kanji Anthony and I've known, well, actually, I've known Kanji's family before she was even born, right? Her dad was like my surrogate father growing up. And so I'm always so grateful for the opportunity to be in her presence. And she has her younger sister also with her here, Janita Anthony. But, you know, I just wanted to give some homage and respect and a whole lot of love to Kanji. You guys have a gem here in Memphis, Tennessee.
She definitely holds Memphis down. Dr. Shabazz, you toured the National Civil Rights Museum this morning. What are some of your reflections on your tour experience this morning?
I think you guys have done an exceptional job in preserving history. You know, I think the last time I was here, it looked like the space was abandoned, right? And to know that the community continues to invest and pour into this necessity of educating. It's, all of the people who come about the importance, not only of the civil rights movement, but the history of the indigenous people here in America, as well as the African diaspora, and and all of the things that we just discussed.
Sure. As we mark the 100th anniversary of your father's birth, how do you think Malcolm X would view the progress or the setbacks we've seen in racial justice and civil rights in America today?
Well, first, let me say that, I am a writer, right? And in ensuring that I was fully prepared, I wrote my responses for your questions, just to make sure that I can be as thorough as possible. Preserving a space like this is so important. My father said it would be this generation of young people who would come to recognize that those in power have misused it and demand change. He would see that in many ways we're still fighting for the same basic human rights young people marched for in the 1950s. My father came along and said, we demand our respect as your as your brother. We demand respect. I'm just so, okay, first let me just back up a little bit, if I may. We just did a podcast discussion. We toured your museum here, and it was really overwhelming. When you are a person who is extremely compassionate and you think in terms of human trafficking, human suffrage, and to revisit that kind of moments in our history can kind of knock you around a little bit. And so I think now, having this opportunity to have this conversation is just a little bit, it's just a little bit of much. So let's just warm up a little bit.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
We just did a podcast, which was really excellent. And the tour was, overwhelming when you think in terms of what people actually experienced, right? And now that we have the opportunity to be here because of them, how did we connect those dots?
Absolutely. Malcolm X's journey from Malcolm Little to El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz is a story of profound transformation. What part of that transformation do you feel is most misunderstood and overlooked by the general public today?
Well, I think that people often treat his experience to Mecca as a reversal when it was actually a broadening. In his own words, he says that Mecca blessed me with a new insight. I saw people of the human family. I saw true brotherhood, right? And he vowed never again to issue a blanket indictment. It deepened his ethics. It didn't dilute his insistence on Black dignity and self-determination. And that's because his transformation was always rooted in education and self-discovery that he got from his parents, right? His father being the chapter president of the Universal Negro Improvement Association in the 1920s that commanded millions of followers worldwide. His mother, who was a recording secretary for that organization and who also ensured Malcolm's love of literary. And so Malcolm educated us, much like you did today, that people of the African diaspora were not simply descendants of slaves. Our ancestors were architects of civilizations, that we were architects, that we were engineers, astronomers, multilinguists, scientists, warriors, artists. My father's evolution was not abandoning Black people and Black pride, but expanding it to embrace our full humanity, demanding recognition as human beings, inclusion in the human family. And so at Oxford, shortly before his political assassination, he said that he would join with anyone who wanted to change the miserable conditions that exist on Earth. And that wasn't a retreat, it was tactical advancement. And personally, I think that's been misunderstood tremendously.
Thank you. When we think of these leaders that have changed the course of American history, there was always a strong woman by their side. And in Malcolm's case, it was your mother, Dr. Betty Shabazz. How did she help preserve and protect your father's legacy in the decades following his senseless assassination?
Well, my mother was just in her 20s. They lived through their home being surveyed. My father was chased throughout this country. He was chased in France. He was, all over the place wanting to assassinate him. And then while she was pregnant with twins and having 4 babies, her home would be firebombed, that he would invite her to the Audubon. And I'm sure she, dressed herself and was really happy that she was going to be with her husband, and walked into the Shabazz, what is now the Shabazz Center, likely with a lot of love and excitement, and walked out shattered, having witnessed, the political assassination of her young husband with her 4 babies, and being pregnant with twins. And the fact that she did not see herself as a victim, the fact that she was able to raise 6 girls with so much that she raised us. And, I often ask, how was she able to do that as a young woman, as a wife of a man who challenged a government that was historically unjust, not to him, but to his people? How was she able to thrive? Not just survive, but how was she able to thrive? She never accepted no or I can't as an answer for herself. She did not see herself as a victim. And, so I take my hat off to my mother quite often because, I just don't understand how she was able to do all that she did. But, my mother kept our father's essence in our household, his love, his values, his humanity. We had not, we didn't really know our father. We were all so young. And she made sure that her 6 daughters did not suffer from the abrupt loss of his presence, because though he was physically gone, she kept her husband part of our household conversations for as long as I can remember, including Kanji's dad. She safeguarded her husband's legacy. When people tell me I should act or speak a certain way because I was Malcolm's daughter, I could hear my mother's words, which I share with my students and in my books. Do not let anyone dictate who you are or who you should be.
Amen. You were very young in February 1965 when your father was murdered. How have your impressions of him evolved over the years through your own growth research and work as an author and educator?
So my mother was barely 30 when, and she had daughters, 6, 4, 2, 1, and she was pregnant with the twins. When we all witnessed the horrific assassination of her husband, our father, and as a child, I knew him through my mother's stories. This incredible man with character and presence as, a 6'4", man. And, I tell people often when I go and see statues of him, they usually have him about 3 feet, 3, 4 feet tall. And of course, not to discriminate with shorter men, but my father was almost 6'5". And we want to see what was he like when he walked into a room? Tall, dashing, debonair, brilliant, compassionate, all of these great qualities and a protector. And so in college, I began to learn about the inaccurate portrayals of his character and life's work. And I discovered how my father's words and his image were intentionally distorted. Through my research and writing, I've come to understand him not just as an icon, but as a young man who made profound sacrifices. And reading his diary, for example, as a mature woman, gave me added respect for the courage required to leave this area of the Middle East and North Africa and return to danger. I've evolved from knowing him as the father I lost to understanding him as a global human rights advocate whose vision on which we're still working to realize. And so as an educator, I return often to his message for young people as critical thinkers that the most important thing that we can do for ourselves is to learn how to think for ourselves. And that line lives in my speeches because it's a compass for how I now see him as a teacher of agency, discipline, and global citizenship.
Can you share a moment or a story about your mother that encapsulates her strength and how she carried forward the values that she and your father shared?
You know, like I said earlier, my mother, she was a young pregnant mother, and she summoned all of what she learned from her parents, steeped in the AME Church in Detroit, Michigan. All of what she learned from the cruelties of racism, sexism, xenophobia, all of what she learned from her husband. And she stood up, she gathered us, and spent the rest of her life making sure we knew we were loved and that we were valued. And despite all of the inaccurate stories written of the African diaspora, the indigenous forefathers who created civilizations at its peak, that she made sure that we grew up with this really sense of self, learning about the significant contributions that women made to the world, the significant contributions that the African diaspora made to the world, learning about the significant contributions. And so that we grew up understanding our roles in society and that we loved ourselves and didn't rely on others to determine our self-worth. I'm so grateful to both of my parents for this tutelage. I think it's one of the greatest gifts that I could have received. Because if we do not know how to love ourselves, then we cannot love others. And this became a prerequisite for who I chose as my close friends and who I chose as my lifetime, my husband. And, if we don't know how to love ourselves, how are we going to learn, or how are we going to know how to love others? And I think it's just something that's extremely important and something that I value and cherish tremendously.
Your father emphasized self-determination, Black dignity, and international human rights. How do these ideas resonate with the movements and activism that we see today?
Well, I think what strikes me most is how my father's framework has become the global language of liberation. My father introduced a human rights agenda to the civil rights movement, and we're witnessing every major movement adopting this lens. Climate activists speak of human rights. Indigenous movements frame land rights as human rights. Economic justice movements center human dignity. And so my father understood that dividing our struggles weakened us all. Today's activists get that. They understand his message when we face divisiveness, which tries to convince us we must choose one over the other, we must choose to come together. And so he taught that our struggle is not just an American problem, it's a world problem, that we can gain clarity when we place local issues in an international context. And I don't think that's strategy, it's thriving in our survival.
It's true.
Yeah.
So true. How do you see young people engaging with your father's work now? And are there ways that you think schools or institutions could do a better job to teach and conceptualize his legacy?
Well, when I see, um, I'll say that I'm encouraged when I see young people discovering Malcolm X through their own research, not waiting for institutions to teach them, but learning on their own. Schools could and should do so much better about educating our young students. I think more importantly, it's our responsibility as a smart, forward-thinking adults. My father said only a fool would sit back and allow his enemy to teach his children.
Mhm.
And so when we know that all of these things existed, to just sit back and allow that to happen, what does that say about our moral compass? And so our academic institutions should teach his autobiography alongside primary sources, his speeches, his diary entries. Students should understand that Malcolm predicted many of today's conditions and often offered solutions we still have not implemented. And as an educator, I believe we must teach the good, the bad, and the ugly. Education is the key to being woke to these injustices. And my mother believed that education was the most powerful tool to combat systemic racism. Schools should teach Malcolm not as a historical figure frozen in 1965, but as someone whose strategies remain urgently relevant.
Wow. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. This is why you come to the National Civil Rights Museum. Malcolm X's later years were marked by a growing global perspective and an emphasis on unity among oppressed peoples. How do you think this evolution should inform current struggles for justice and coalition building?
Well, my father's global perspective came from understanding that racism, colonialism, and economic exploitation were connected systems. He was building bridges between the civil rights movement and anti-colonial struggles in Africa, Asia, and in Latin America. Today, when I see Palestinian activists standing with Black Lives Matter, when I see indigenous movements connecting with immigrant rights organizers, that is Malcolm's vision realized. His evolution shows us that we can expand our circle of solidarity without abandoning our particular struggles. He never stopped advocating for Black liberation. He just understood it was impossible without human liberation. And current movements need to embrace that complexity to be both specific and universal. Rather see ourselves as a minority. We are the majority of good people in the world who demand to be included in the human family. And the only way we are going to resolve these continued annihilations, right? This continued genocide. We're going to continue to see it until we come together based on our humanity and have compassion for Palestine, for Bosnia, for South Africa, for the Congo, as we would our own families.
In a time where media often distills and simplifies complex legacies, what do you wish more people truly understood about Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz, not just as historical figures, but as people?
Well, I wish people knew about their ordinary moments. Malcolm helping his children with homework, Betty making dinner, family conversations about ideas and dreams. My mother kept my father present in our household conversations through stories, ensuring we knew his humor, his tenderness, his curiosity. We had his hat his shoes, size 14 shoes, that I would put my feet in because I got the biggest feet of all the, and clunk around the house. We had all of these things, his briefcase, you know, people would come over and they couldn't believe that we had this beautiful collection, my father's collection of butterflies. He was from, middle America. He was from the Midwest. And my mother kept my father present. He read constantly and she pursued education relentlessly. They loved it and admired and respected one another. Both understood that liberation started with the mind. People see the speeches and the tragedy. They were young parents thriving and striving to raise conscious and conscientious children while still changing the world. Malcolm's diary reveals a man grappling with profound questions, with the sense of loneliness, not someone with all the answers. Betty's decision to befriend Aunt Coretta Scott King shows a woman who chose solidarity over separation. They were complex, evolving humans, not frozen symbols. And it is their undying love for themselves and all of us that keeps them relevant. Self-love. It's the greatest gift that my mother gave me, my mother and my father.
Let's go a little off before we conclude this next question. And I think that this particular excerpt that I'm going to read from your father, he delivered this in the middle of the Civil Rights Act going through the largest filibuster in United States history. And what many people often forget is that Malcolm X himself was an activist for the right to vote. And in April of 1964 in Cleveland, in what I would call one of his most pinnacle address to date, called the ballot or the bullet. And in the current state of America that we're in right now, I'm just going to read an excerpt of what Minister Malcolm said almost 60 years ago from this moment that we're currently in. And he said, "The political philosophy of Black nationalism means that the Black man should control the politics and the politicians in his own community, no more. The Black man in the Black community has to be re-educated into the science of politics so that he will know what politics is supposed to bring him in return. Don't be throwing out any ballots. A ballot is like a bullet. You don't throw your ballots until you see the target. And if that target is not within your reach, you keep that ballot in your pocket. The social philosophy of Black nationalism only means that we have to get together and remove the evils, the vices, the alcoholism, the addictions, and other evils that are destroying the moral fiber of our community." Let that last sentence resonate for a second. So in a way to honor and to preserve the legacies of the Malcolm X's and the Dr. Betty Shabazz's, their teachings have always been here. And so as Malcolm once stated, he made the quote, "Education is the passport to our future. In today's climate of book bans and historical erasures," what does that quote mean to you today, Dr. Shabazz?
Say that last part.
In today's climate of book bans, education is the passport to the future. In today's climate of book bans and historical erasure, what does that quote mean to you today?
I mean, it's so relevant to what we're experiencing right now. And it is the reason why we have to continue to preserve these institutions, to preserve our stories, to make sure that we're pouring into the next generation like you, so that you can continue and all of our young people can continue to share our history. I mean, it is extremely important.
Yeah. As we commemorate your father's 100th birthday, what is your hope for how his and your mother's legacies are carried 100 years from now?
Well, my hope is that we finally catch up to where my parents were 60 years ago. My father introduced a human rights framework we're still trying to implement. Betty showed us how to preserve truth while building the future. I hope their legacies inspire young people to see education as revolutionary, to understand that self-love and self-knowledge are prerequisites for liberation. The Malcolm X and Betty Shabazz Memorial and Education Center in New York City gathers people to continue their revolutionary legacy of collective liberation. My hope is that in 100 years from today, that we won't need to quote his words about injustice because we will have built the just world he envisioned. And however, until then, we must continue their work with discipline, love, and an unwavering commitment to human dignity. Life is not a destination, it is a journey. Faith makes everything possible.
Thank you, Dr. Shabazz. I want to talk to you about these books. As you've let it known that you're an educator and an author. And we've got 3 books here that we also will be selling today here at the National Civil Rights Museum outside in our store. We have 4 books that all are available here to purchase, and Mrs. Shabazz will autograph. But I want you to talk a little bit about each of the 3 that we have here and what was your source of inspiration for conceiving these and writing these.
So let's see. So I was at, I don't know if Barnes & Noble exists anymore here in Memphis. Do you still have it here?
Mhm.
Oh, okay. Well, we have 1 or 2 where I live, and they used to just be everywhere. And I was in Barnes & Noble. We were at a mall with a lot of young, beautiful girls. And I told them they could have anything they wanted. They wanted to go to Barnes & Noble. So I was, pretty excited, told them to get whatever book they wanted. And they were bringing the books to me. And when I looked at the books, there was nothing that was a reflection of who they were that would speak some kind of pride or something. And so I decided I was going to write a children's book, Malcolm Little, the boy who grew up to become Malcolm X, so that young people could see a reflection of themselves as well as learn something about history. X, a novel, was written before I wrote The Awakening of Malcolm X, to speak to young people who find themselves at a crossroads. I often say when young people do find themselves, in a challenging space, they don't say, let me go get a good education, right? It's usually, let me drown it out with self-destruction, right? And so my father, having lost his father being lynched, his mother taken to an institution against her will, as they did many women back in those days, found himself running from his identity, all the things that his parents instilled in him, but were no longer there to protect him, running from himself against the backdrop of Jim Crow, and getting incarcerated at the age of 19, 20, and being forced to confront all from which he was running, and becoming Malcolm X. But there was a lot of focus on a whole lot of other things, and I decided to write The Awakening of Malcolm X, where you see Malcolm in prison as the star debater, debating on issues like capital punishment, and it being broadcasted through the airwaves of Boston because they were really fascinated with this young man. And so they would debate Harvard, MIT, Boston University, and they would win. And so it shows that Malcolm was always an avid learner. He didn't go to jail as a, thug and walk out as an icon, right? But that he went into jail as a human being, parents who loved him, that poured into him, and discovered all of the things from which he was running. And yes, and so that's what these books are.
Great. Any final thoughts, Dr. Shabazz, on the legacy of your father and your mother, and what we as society can do to push forward through the storm that we as a society are in the middle of.
Well, my father said, if you put a knife in my back 9 inches and you pull it out 6 inches, the knife is still in my back. There's no progress. If you take the knife all the way out, that's not progress. Progress is healing the wound that the blow made. So we have to recognize, you know, the terror that happened. And as he said, we demand our human rights as your brother. We demand our human rights as ordained by God, that we should also have this sense of urgency to ensure that people understand Black power is not exclusionary. It simply says we want our place back in the human family. And it should be very clear.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Ilyasah Shabazz. What we will do now is, please, if you all have not, please come and purchase one of the books authored by Dr. Shabazz outside in our museum store, and she will be situated in the northwest corner of the room. And from there, please continue to support the National Civil Rights Museum. Please join us on October the 16th for our annual Freedom Award event at the Orpheum in Halloran. Thank you again for coming out. I will never be able to replicate what this feels like. Thank you. This is such a rewarding time. It's something that's needed in a time where we get so full of what's going on. And so this is the perfect